Hi guys, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we'll be doing Agesilaus from ancient Sparta and Pompey from ancient Rome. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin. So Agesilaus was son of Archidamus, who was the son of Zeuxidamus, who were kings of Sparta. More specifically, Archidamus reigned pretty gloriously in Sparta, but he had two sons of different wives. Firstly, Agis, and secondly, Agesilaus. So it was very unlikely that Agesilaus, who was much younger than Agis, would ever become king. So he was trained in the normal upbringing of Spartan children, known as agogi, where they were trained to be men and trained to be fighters, but most of all to respect their superiors. With that, even then, Agis had a son, so it was very unlikely that Agesilaus would ever become leader. More specifically, Agesilaus also had one leg short of the other, and he was a smaller individual, so it was unlikely that he would ever achieve the greatness that he ultimately achieved. With that, ultimately, Agis died, and his son, Leotychides, was thought to not actually be the rightful heir of the throne, as his father was supposedly Alcibiades. So when Alcibiades was fighting for Sparta, supposedly he had an affair with his mother, Agis' wife, and supposedly was not heir to the throne. So while Agesilaus was in Agogi, Lysander, who was a great general in the Peloponnesian War, really becomes fond of Agesilaus. Sort of in Sparta, they really had this sort of mentorship program where an older individual would often have a relationship with a younger teen. It's often considered it was sexual, but I think in most cases it wasn't. But either way, Lysander really wanted Agesilaus to become king, and he sort of helps Agesilaus in defaming Leotychides and wins the throne for Agesilaus at a later age. He ultimately doesn't take the throne until he's in his about 40s, when he's quite old, especially in those times. And despite this, he ends up proving to be quite a good leader, because he was very much more connected with the people, having been raised with the people and having grown with the people. But also, he made efforts to please the ephors and elders. So the ephors were elected, powerful people in Sparta, and the elders were elected for life. And he stood whenever an ephor would enter into the atrium, or he would give a cloak and ox to any elder when they were elected to become an elder. So he made great efforts in winning their affection. And this, in conjunction with the affection he won of the people, made him really quite a popular leader. With that, at one point the ephors did want to were worried that he was getting too powerful, and they wanted him to have conflict, sort of, as Plutarch notes. It's sort of like how in Homer, Agamemnon wanted conflict between Ulysses and Achilles, as he feared that the two were becoming too powerful, but also a little bit of healthy competition would have been better for the public good. So either way, the Persian navy started to get a lot more powerful and sort of started undermining the Spartan authority and Lysander and the Spartan supremacy, because coming out of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans essentially controlled all of Greece, including Thebes and Athens, who were overthrown by Sparta. But Lysander, who had placed a lot of diplomats in Persia, also many of these diplomats started to get killed and get sent out of the country, so he convinces Agesilaus to build up an army to go and start suppressing the Persians. With that, he establishes quite a large army with 2,000 Neodemes, which are freed helots, former slaves, 6,000 allies, and 30 generals, one of which was Lysander. On the way there, he has this dream. Supposedly, the last leader of all of Greece was Agamemnon, and Agamemnon also went into Persia, or Troy, and in doing so, he had to make a sacrifice. and the dream essentially dictated that Agesilaus needed to make a sacrifice. However, the sacrifice was the daughter, so he thought that wasn't fitting because it was a goddess in the dream anyway, so he thought he would sacrifice a deer. But the people of Thebes, since he wanted to use his own soothsayer in the land, refused, and ultimately the sacrifice never happened. So once again, another bad omen. An earlier omen also warned much of Sparta that there will be a lame reign, which Agesilaus was considered lame for his smaller stature and limp leg. However, Lysander made good efforts in helping him win the throne and by proving his bloodline. But either way, they set off to Persia, and while there, he starts getting really jealous of his mentor, Lysander, who's much more popular amongst the army, and he eventually tells Lysander that he has to be butcher for the people, completely eradicates him from the role, which really upsets Lysander. Lysander is not bitter, but he's sort of upset that this youth that he trained throughout his whole life is sort of turning against him. Eventually, he decides that he will grant him continued power over the navy, but essentially pushes him out of Persia because he was essentially jealous. In the Persian battle, he makes use of the army of 10,000, which was a pretty powerful Greek mercenary army. It's kind of like you might see in Game of Thrones. If you've seen that show, they have that really powerful mercenary army. I think it's also 10,000 too. But either way, he wins a great deal of riches for Sparta, but ultimately he is called back because starts to be uprisings in Greece of many of the states that were formerly under Spartan supremacy. So essentially, so he gets called back to fight the Corinthian War, which involved the Athenians, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and some of the other smaller states. And he was particularly already angry with Thebes because they rejected his sacrifice on going to Persia. So, and these states were all united under a bribe of 10. So essentially, he starts heading into Thessaly, and he wins a decisive victory. However, he loses much of his baggage and loot, and also sustains quite a few wounds. With that, ultimately, Lysander also ends up dying when he's attacking the walls of Thebes, which is kind of indicative of his character. If you watch the Lysander video, he was sort of ruthless in terms of taking risks. Ultimately, he sort of starts getting older because he already took the reign so late in his life, and the Epidemonius from Thebes almost takes Sparta while he's away, and ultimately, when he heads back to Sparta, he dies on his way home, returning from Sparta to sort of help them out at the age of 84. So sort of in the latter parts of his life, he wasn't fighting as many victories or fighting as many battles. So for him, who didn't start as early, as we will see in Pompey, he starts very early, he did not get to really accomplish too much in the latter point of his life because he was sick for much of it. But ultimately, the Spartan hegemony fails and many of the states get freed from their rulership, and he dies. And during his lifetime, and sort of the reason why I don't have too many pictures of him was that he really refused having any statues or paintings made for him. He has this quote, I have it here: If I've done any noble action, that is sufficient memorial. If I've done nothing noble, all the statues in the world will not preserve my memory. So Plutarch still included him on his life, so he's still, in all intensive purposes, made fame for himself without the need for excessive or even any sort of commemoration or statues or paintings. So let's continue on to Pompey. I'm trying to keep this one quick because Pompey will be very long, and there'll be quite a bit of overlap in the next video on Julius Caesar. So Pompey's father was quite powerful. He was a consul of Rome. However, he fell out of favor posthumously for being so greedy and so for stealing a lot of wealth from the public. It's said it was like how Prometheus liked Hercules despite how he hated his father. Supposedly, that's what Plutarch references. But essentially, upon his father's death, who was supposedly killed by getting struck by lightning, they even dragged him off the bier, and he was really, really unfortunate in that regard. But despite this, he was really loved by all his peers. He was supposedly quite handsome. His hair, it was said, stuck up in the front. It said he had eyes like Alexander, and on many occasions he was even called Alexander. He later wins the title of the Great from Sylla, so further reinforcing that fact. He lived a modest and temperate living. He was trained in the arts of war. He had persuasive speech and trustworthy character. He gave without arrogance and received without the loss of dignity. So many people do quite the contrary. They give and they end up appearing arrogant, and they receive and they lose their dignity. So he did it in a way that benefited him and made him successful. It said he had a boyish loveliness, kingly nature. At one point, Lucius Philippus, who was a famous man in Rome, on pleading on his behalf, said, Nothing strange if he, being Philip, loved Alexander. So that's just an anecdote of a man referring to Pompey as Alexander. So when he was younger, he was in love with this girl named Flora, who was pretty much the most beautiful woman in the land. Medalists dedicated portraits to her in Castor and Pollux, which are two many great sites in ancient Rome. But she received an offer from an individual named Geminius, and she refused him originally because she wanted to consult Pompey first, who she was actually in love with. But Pompey said that she could go with Geminius, and both regretted it in later life, and sort of a sad story for him, and that's why I guess he was so open to having many other political affairs and political wives rather than marrying for love, because the love of his life already kind of passed away quite early, or was passed on to another individual. Either way, he ultimately his first starts off fighting for his father, and at one point there's a plot to kill him, but it ultimately fails, and through this plot he ends up winning more respect through the soldiers by finding out about the plot and bowing down to them and earning the respect of his soldier. But once his father dies, he gets tried to compensate or recover all the things that were stolen, the public goods that were stolen from the public on behalf of his father. But in the court trial, he manages to win the affection of the juror or the justice, and ends up marrying his daughter. So he is ultimately acquitted, and it is quite a ceremonious wedding. At that point, Sylla is out of Rome, and he is sent to fight for Cinna, who was sort of Sylla's opponent and Marius's protege on the Populares side. He ran away, and the army of Cinna's, who thought that Cinna had killed Pompey, instead kill Cinna. So, which did multiple fold. Firstly, it proved how much they were fond of Pompey, but secondly, it ridded them of Cinna, but put in an even more dangerous and more tyrannical leader. The name of the leader was Carbo. So he runs off to his old province of Picenum, and he who had never held any sort of office or had never been a general, rallies his own troops himself and starts marching towards Sylla, who he supported, who represented the optimates and the upper class, and was heading towards Rome to defeat Carbo and take Rome for the second time. So on this, he starts rallying a bunch of troops. He was only 23 at the time, and he marches towards Sylla, but he does so very slowly because he wants to attract a lot of attention. On the way, he is surrounded on three sides by Carinus, Clodius, and Brutus, and he manages to fend off them, winning much acclaim and respect from Sylla, who actually at the time was not aware of this. Additionally, Carbo sends some troops at him, and he also managed to fend off them by sending them into more difficult lands where they were not able to fight. On approaching Sylla, Sylla sees a young group of very valiant and well-tuned soldiers approaching him, and he takes off his helmet and salutes him Appurator, which was quite a title for one who had never even held office, and one that was only really for senators. So that was a great honor from Sylla. Ultimately, Sylla takes Rome, and he really admired Pompey's abilities, and he wanted to connect them through blood. So despite Pompey being married, and despite his daughter-in-law being married and having a daughter, he arranges for the two of them to be married so that they could be connected by blood, which was a very beneficial thing in Rome, where there was so much dirty politics. Being related by blood was one of the best ways of connecting people, which ultimately ends up happening between Julius Caesar, as we will see in a bit. So he marries Metellus's daughter, and he is sent to Sicily to attack Carbo, who had a fleet, and he manages to do quite well there, and he manages to capture Carbo and shows him quite a bit of kindness in his trial by giving him a fair trial. Ultimately, Carbo is killed, but this was unlike Pompey, because historically he had given many people unfair trials, but to the harshest of enemies he gave them a good trial, which showed perhaps that he had variable temperance, but more complex character than many other people in Rome at the time. And for this, he got the title Young Butcher, or Adolescent Butcher, because he was so young at the time. And Sylla sends him to Africa, and while there, one of the people tries to get him to betray Sylla, and he says, "I would rather die than betray Sylla." And he returns from Africa after winning many, many great victories, and he asks Sylla if he could have a triumph, which he had never even held proper office. A triumph is essentially when they enter Rome with a big, like a big parade, and originally Sylla said no because it would undermine the laws and authorities, but he has this quote, the people love the rising sun more than they love the setting sun. So he's essentially convincing Sylla that Sylla is on the decline and Pompey was on the incline, and to do so and to allow him this favor would be great. So he has this great first triumph of his where he sends in a bunch of elephants and achieves a great amount of fame in Rome. With that, there's the Sylla eventually passes away, and the populares start gaining a lot more power, and he makes efforts to control them, but ultimately he is sent to support Metellus in Hispania, which is modern-day Spain, where Sertorius was essentially had started his own empire and needed to be destroyed, and did a great job of it too. In Sertorius' defense, Pompey and Metellus, it was 2 against 1. They were receiving many great reinforcements from Rome, whereas Sertorius managed to fight 2 against 1 and managed to hold off against the whole Roman Empire. So kudos to him for that. But with that, after defeating him, the Servile War, or the Spartacus War, breaks out, where Spartacus starts an uprising amongst gladiators to rebel against the Roman people. Crassus, who was one of Pompey's sort of political opponents, but at many times also political allies, was worried that Pompey and Lucullus, who was also coming from the Mithridatic War, would steal his fame, so he rushes the war. But Pompey claims a lot of fame for the war too, saying that he slayed a lot of the up to 6,000 people who were escaping. Ultimately, one of the greatest crimes in history, I would say, they crucify 6,000 of these slaves and gladiators along the road to Rome, which was, I could only imagine, would be such a cruel sight to see. 6,000 people crucified. Even the image of one would be quite brutal to see. But ultimately, at the age of 35, he is finally elected consul despite having fought so many wars already, and he gets his second triumph in the Hispanias, which technically, again, he was still too young to do so, but the people didn't really care because at that point he was a popular. He helps Crassus. So Crassus, as reflected in the earlier video, was the richest man in Rome. So Crassus wanted to become consul, and Pompey decides to help him out, and they become consul together. However, they disagree on almost everything, and nothing really gets done. Some of the people say that they should both step down if they don't end up agreeing, but ultimately they didn't. But what Pompey did was he sort of repealed some of Sylla's reforms. So Sylla had a certain reform where tribunes of the plebeian court could not rerun for any sort of public office. So this kind of disincentivized people to run for the office. But Pompey, despite being a student of Sylla and saying he would never betray him, repeals some of his laws posthumously. But this also won him more respect amongst the people. So essentially after that, he is given, there's a shortage of grains and imports due to a serious issue with pirates in the Mediterranean. And he is granted with quite a bit of difficulty one of the plebeian tribunes promotes a law that allowed an individual to get almost complete control of the budget and the naval paddlers in the Mediterranean. And ultimately, Pompey wins this. So at this point, it's said that he had control of almost the complete military and the complete navy. And within 40 days, he pretty much clears out the western Mediterranean, and in 40 more days, he clears out the eastern. So he became extremely powerful for this. And after that, he finishes up Lucullus's job in the Third Mithridatic War, which took place in Greece, and he wins there. He continues down south of Armenia. He gets through into Syria, Judea. He even sieges Jerusalem. And amongst these states, he establishes the Decapolis, which is a culmination of 10 states, an alliance between them under Roman authority. However, they each had autonomy, and they started what's called the Pompey Era, which is a dating or a calendar system that starts on that date, the 63rd BC, when he established this Decolian League. So with that, a new up and start. So it's kind of no one can stay in the shine under the sun for too long. Caesar starts to become extremely popular and returns from Hispanias and wins much favor amongst the populares for his land distributions. And despite Pompey, it seems almost anywhere in the world, as people get older and older, they start to become more conservative or more optimates in Rome. And where Pompey was very much out of support from the Senate in his early career, now the Senate preferred Pompey and feared Julius, who was much more popular against the populace. However, fortunately, there was what's called the First Triumvirate, which was comprised of Crassus, the richest man in Rome, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, which was a sort of alliance. And with that, Julius Caesar marries Pompey's one of Pompey's daughters in order to connect them both in terms of for political reasons. But ultimately they both start getting more and more powerful, and neither of them two want to settle down their armies. But ultimately, when Julius's wife Julia, the daughter of Pompey, dies in childbirth, and as does the daughter, their relationship really ruptures. And Julius Caesar, who had been fighting the Gallic Wars, starts deciding to head down towards Rome and remove Pompey from power. And since neither of the two wanted to lay down their army, eventually Julius Caesar starts marching on Rome with one legion, crossing the Rubicon, and many of the states and the populares really supported him, and many didn't even put up a fight and joined Julius Caesar. And ultimately, Pompey leaves Rome and gets chased through Greece and all the way into Egypt. And in Egypt, he with his wife on a ship. She recognizes something is strange, and he is stabbed and murdered and assassinated. And that was the end of Pompey. So I think it's kind of a revolving door for Pompey, and it's kind of unfortunate. Even before I ever heard of Pompey, I always thought he was just sort of the enemy of Julius Caesar, and I failed to recognize that he was great in his own. He was Pompey the Great, and for a time he was the greatest in the world. He was just in the time between Sylla and Julius Caesar, the greatest man in the world, but history seems to only glorify Julius Caesar because he came after and ultimately defeated him. But in his time, especially in his younger years, he was the greatest conqueror in the world. It said he outshined many of his other contemporaries, whereas other conquerors of Rome only managed to conquer 2 continents. He was conquered all 3, well, not the entirety of all 3 continents, but conquered on all 3. So with that, I think we'll go into the comparison. So I guess in terms of similarities, they were very successful because of their respective mentors, Lysander and Sylla, and without them, they wouldn't have been too successful. They both had incredible control over their states. Pompey had 3 triumphs. He was so successful getting consulship before he was even old, just defying laws left, right, and center. And Agesilaus had almost complete control of all of Greece at a time just post-Peloponnesian War. And thirdly, they both had an obscure rise to power. Pompey's father was very much out of fame and out of notoriety, and Agesilaus was not in line for the throne, and he had sort of a disadvantageous physical appearance. In terms of their differences, it's said that Pompey attained his success in a much more fair manner, whereas Agesilaus sort of betrayed the gods. Many of the oracles said that he should not lead and supposedly he betrayed his own family when Leotychides was, even though a bastard, he took the throne from him and defamed him. In terms of their respect for their mentors, even when Sylla ultimately starts defying Pompey, Pompey never defies Sylla. He always stays true to him. He does, however, posthumously defy him a little bit, but Plutarch considers him as more respectful of his master or his mentor, whereas Agesilaus, within his own lifetime, sort of starts defying Lysander. Maybe this is because Lysander started going a little bit crazy as well, but that Sylla also started going a little bit tyrannical as well. So, in terms of the places they conquered, Pompey, after he defeated the pirates, he granted them autonomy over their own states. When he reached Syria and as far as Jordan, he granted them autonomy of their own states and their own governments and laws, whereas Agesilaus fought vehemently to keep Thebes and Athens from uprising and keep them under control and prevented them from getting any sort of autonomy. So quite the opposite in that regard. In the end, when Pompey ultimately left Rome, when he knew Julius Caesar was going to take it, Plutarch criticizes him, saying he should have stayed and fought till the end, whereas Agesilaus, despite getting sick and despite sometimes being away, never would have given up Sparta in his own lifetime. And lastly, Pompey was much more pompous, I would say. He had 3 triumphs and very much glorified his own doings. In his 3rd triumph, it said he wore the cloak of Alexander the Great and had up to 365 captives who were kings and royalties, whereas Agesilaus would not even have one statue built for him or one painting built for him, which was sort of the result of his upbringing and Spartan customs. But even then, despite his great power, he never did anything of that sort. So yeah, that's Agesilaus and Pompey. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you watch the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.